I've been driving rigs for 25 years. I've seen every stretch of blacktop in this country, from the snow-dusted peaks of Montana to the sweat-soaked highways of Louisiana. If there's a road, I've driven it. If there's a diner, I've eaten there. And if there's a truck stop, I've had my fill of burnt coffee and rubbery eggs. You do something long enough, you learn its patterns, its quirks. You know when something's off. And that night, driving through the deep belly of West Texas, something was off. It was October 14th, 2019. A Tuesday. I remember because I had just gotten a new haul out of El Paso, a straight run to Houston, mostly empty highway, just the kind of ride I liked. No stops. No small talk with gas station clerks. No idiot four-wheelers cutting me off like they had a death wish. Just me, my truck, and the road. It was supposed to be an easy run. It wasn't. I was about an hour outside of Van Horn, cruising I-10. If you've never been out that way, it's nothing but desolation. Flat, open land that stretches so far you'd think God ran out of ideas and just let the place sit unfinished. No houses. No lights. Just the occasional scrub brush and the long, lonesome highway. There's a reason they call it one of the most haunted roads in America. But I didn't believe in all that crap. I still don't. Not exactly. The first thing that happened was small. The CB radio crackled. That's normal. Old truck radios are like ghosts themselves, sometimes picking up bits of random chatter, sometimes just giving off dead air. But this wasn't static. It was a whisper. At first, I thought it was just a weak signal from another driver. Maybe some kid messing around on an open channel. But it wasn't words. Just this low, breathy sound. Like someone standing just behind me, whispering right into my ear. I checked the CB, flipped through channels, but there was nothing else. Just that whisper. And then, silence. I turned the volume down and kept rolling. Then, the lights started acting up. My dashboard flickered, first the radio, then the instrument panel. My speedometer needle dropped to 0, then jumped back up. The engine didn't hiccup, nothing else felt wrong, but the lights kept pulsing like a heartbeat. That was weird, sure, but trucks have electrical problems all the time. I figured it was a loose fuse or something in the wiring. Still, my gut was telling me something was wrong. I should have listened. Around 2:30 a.m., I saw the first sign of life in miles. A gas station. The kind of place that probably hadn't been updated since the 80s. Just a single pump and a flickering neon sign that read fuel open 24 hours. I wasn't low on gas, but something in me, a deep, crawling sense of unease, told me to stop. Just for a minute. Just to step out of the cab, stretch my legs, maybe shake the feeling that was gnawing at me. I pulled in, cut the engine. The place was dead. No attendant, no customers, no lights inside the store. Just that buzzing neon sign barely holding on. I stepped out of my rig, and that's when I noticed something strange. The air was too still. West Texas always has wind. Even at night, there's a low howl or rustling of dry grass, something. But here? Nothing. Not a single sound. No crickets. No hum of electricity. Just absolute, deafening silence. And then I saw it. A figure. Standing just beyond the reach of the neon light, at the edge of the desert. It wasn't moving. Just standing there. No car. No reason to be out there. Just a tall, thin silhouette against the nothingness. My chest went tight. I've seen plenty of drifters, plenty of weirdos at truck stops, but this was different. This wasn't some lost hitchhiker. This thing, whoever it was standing too still. Too rigid. Like they weren't just standing, but waiting. I took a step back toward my cab. I wasn't going to mess around with some freak in the middle of nowhere. But as soon as I moved, so did it. One step. That was all. Just one. But it was enough. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself back into the truck, turned the key, and fired up the engine. As I pulled away, my headlights washed over the spot where the figure had been. But there was nothing there. Just empty desert. And that's when the whispering started again. Not through the CB. Not from outside. But from inside the cab. And this time, it said my name. I slammed the pedal so hard my boot nearly cracked the floorboard, the truck roaring as it lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. My heart was hammering, and I don't scare easy. I've had my fair share of close calls, bad wrecks, and run-ins with people who don't have a damn thing to lose, but this was different. This wasn't something I could explain, and that's what made it worse. The whispering wasn't just static now. It was a voice. My name, stretched out in a slow, breathy hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel. I yanked the CB radio off its mount, half expecting some punk kid messing around on an open channel, but the moment I flipped through the frequencies, I knew I was wrong. The radio was off. Dead air. And yet, the voice didn't stop. My grip tightened around the wheel, my knuckles aching from the pressure. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, but something in me, something primal, knew I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, my entire body screaming at me to look, to check the mirror, to see what was in the truck with me. But I didn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't. The road ahead stretched on, an endless black ribbon cutting through the desert. The dashboard clock read 2:37 a.m. 7 minutes since I left the gas station. It felt like hours. The voice had gone silent, but the silence was worse, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight on my chest. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, like something is just behind you, waiting for the right moment to let you know it's there. Then I heard it. A knock. It was soft, almost gentle, like the way a child taps on glass to get someone's attention. It came from inside the sleeper cab behind me. I nearly lost control, the truck swerving as my body tensed, my breath ragged, my pulse slamming against my ribs. My instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to ignore it, to get to a town, anywhere with people. But another part of me, some deep, awful curiosity, made my fingers reach out, shaking as I pulled the curtain back an inch. Just enough to see. Nothing. Just darkness. My unrumpled blankets, the small mini-fridge, the faint outline of my duffel bag. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding, trying to convince myself it had been in my head, that maybe the truck had settled weird over a pothole or the wind had knocked something against the frame. But then it came again. Louder this time. A sharp, deliberate knock-knock. From the passenger's seat. My body locked up, rigid with fear, my fingers locked in a death grip around the wheel. I didn't turn my head, but I didn't have to. I could see it in my peripheral vision. A shape. Sitting there, right beside me. Too tall. Too thin. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching. My mind screamed at me not to look, to pretend I didn't see, to just drive. Because I knew, somehow, in that deep, ancient part of the brain that still remembers what real terror is, that if I turned my head, if I so much as glanced at it, I wouldn't be leaving this highway alive. And then the voice came again. "Don't look, Daniel." I sucked in a sharp breath, choking on the air in my lungs. My name. It knew my name. How the hell did it know my name? My foot pressed harder on the pedal, pushing the rig past 70, past 80, the wheels screaming against the asphalt as I fought the urge to look, to acknowledge that thing beside me. It didn't move. The knocking had stopped. But the voice? It was closer now, like breath on my ear. "Keep driving, Daniel. Don't stop. You're almost there." I felt something shift beside me, a slow, creaking motion, like it was leaning in. My stomach twisted violently, my body shuddering, and I thought I might throw up. Then, up ahead, headlights pierced through the night. A rest stop. Salvation. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right, tires screeching against the pavement as I barreled into the parking lot, the truck groaning as I forced it into a sudden stop. And then, nothing. Silence. I sat there, panting, hands still locked onto the wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I had to look. I had to know if it was still there. Slowly, every muscle in my neck resisting, I turned my head. The seat was empty. The truck was empty. But on the windshield, pressed against the inside of the glass, was a single, perfect handprint. The fingers were too long. And it was still wet. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my chest heaving as I forced air into my lungs, staring at that wet handprint on the inside of my windshield. The fingers stretched longer than any human should, the palm too narrow, the smudged streaks of moisture trailing downward as if whatever had been sitting beside me had slowly pulled its hand away. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe. If I acknowledged it, if I let it sink in, then I had to admit that something had been in my truck with me. I forced my hand off the wheel, my fingers stiff and shaking as I reached out. I hesitated just an inch away from the glass, hovering over the print. The cab was cold, but the moisture, it was warm. The moment my skin touched it, a sharp, gut-wrenching chill shot through me, like I had stuck my hand in ice water. I yanked back as if burned, my breath hitching in my throat, and then I did something I don't do. I prayed. Not words, not anything I'd learned in church as a kid, just a desperate, silent plea to anything that might listen. The truck stoplights flickered above me, casting long shadows across the pavement. I took in my surroundings, trying to shake the feeling that if I looked away from the windshield for even a second, that print might move. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of rigs lined up further down and a lone pickup truck by the convenience store entrance. The store was open, the fluorescent glow spilling onto the cracked pavement, but I couldn't see anyone inside. No clerk. No customers. I needed to get out of the truck. I needed air, needed to put distance between me and whatever the hell had just been sitting beside me. My hand found the door handle, but the second I touched it, something clicked in the sleeper behind me. It wasn't loud. Just a small, deliberate sound. A lock disengaging. I went still, my fingers frozen on the handle. My breath was slow, controlled, but inside, my mind was screaming at me to move. The sleeper door. I knew I had locked it. I always locked it. But now, in the silence of the cab, I could feel it, a presence behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for the key in the ignition, ready to start the truck up and floor it the hell out of there. But just as my fingers grazed the key, the CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was static. Just a low hum. But then... Daniel. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The voice was wrong. It wasn't coming through the CB in the normal way. It was too close, too inside the cab, like someone was speaking just behind me. You brought me here, Daniel. A whisper, curling in my ear like breath, and that was it. I threw the door open and jumped out of the truck. My boots hit the pavement hard, the night air sharp in my lungs, but I didn't stop moving. I walked fast, straight toward the store, refusing to look back, refusing to turn around and see whatever was still inside my rig. The glass doors slid open with a tired, mechanical hiss as I stepped into the convenience store. The air inside was thick with the smell of old coffee and floor cleaner, but there was no one at the counter. The place was silent. I glanced around, my hands still shaking as I reached for my phone in my pocket, but my fingers barely brushed the screen before I noticed it. The store wasn't empty. A man stood at the back, near the coolers. He wasn't shopping, wasn't looking at anything. He was just standing there, facing the glass doors, his eyes locked directly on me. I stopped, my stomach twisting into knots. He was tall, real thin, dressed in a dusty button-up and jeans. He should have looked normal. Just some other late-night traveler passing through. But he didn't blink. He didn't breathe. His chest wasn't rising and falling. His arms hung stiff at his sides, his fingers curled, just slightly, like he was waiting to grab something. Or someone. I took a slow step backward, my boots scuffing against the linoleum, and that was when I saw them. More figures. They were outside now, in the parking lot, standing by my truck. 5, maybe 6 of them. Tall, thin, motionless. Their faces were hidden in shadow, their bodies barely illuminated by the flickering truck stop lights. But I knew, somehow, that they were all staring at me. The man in the store hadn't moved, hadn't so much as twitched. But his mouth, his lips barely parted, and I heard it even from across the store. A whisper. "You shouldn't have stopped." My throat went dry, the air in the store suddenly thick, heavy, pressing down on my lungs. The man by the cooler still hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Just standing there, facing me, his head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening. My eyes flicked back to the parking lot, to the figures standing near my truck. They hadn't been there when I pulled in, but now there were more. 8, maybe 10. All of them standing perfectly still, their long, thin silhouettes barely shifting under the weak glow of the truck stop lights. I could feel my pulse hammering against my ribs as I took another step back, my boots scraping against the linoleum. The man inside the store twitched. Just a small motion, his fingers tightening at his sides, but it sent a fresh wave of cold down my spine. I knew if I didn't do something, if I didn't move, something was going to happen. I forced my legs to work, turning toward the counter, slamming my palm down on the service bell. The sharp ding echoed through the empty store. Nothing. No clerk. No sound. Nothing but the hum of the refrigerated coolers and the flickering fluorescent light overhead. The man in the back finally moved. Not a step, not a shift of weight, just his mouth. Slowly, his lips parted, and he whistled. The sound was low, tuneless, almost gentle, but the moment it left his lips, the figures outside reacted. In perfect unison, their heads all snapped toward the store, their bodies swaying just slightly, like they were waiting for some kind of signal. I felt my stomach twist, bile rising in my throat. I took another step back. The man whistled again. A second later, the glass doors slid open. I didn't see anyone enter. Didn't hear footsteps. But somehow, someone was inside now. The air changed. The temperature dropped. And then, just behind me, so close I felt the breath on my neck, a voice whispered, "Daniel." I spun, my fists clenched, ready to swing, ready to do something. But there was no one there. Just empty space. My pulse was thundering now, my vision tunneling as I forced my breath into slow, shallow gulps. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my body wasn't moving. It was like something was keeping me in place, keeping me frozen. The man by the coolers took a step forward. His foot made no sound when it touched the floor. His limbs were wrong, too loose, like a puppet with its strings barely holding together. He took another step, his head tilting, those unblinking eyes locked on mine. I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward, nearly knocking over a display of snack cakes. My fingers dug into the edge of the counter, grounding myself, forcing my body to listen. Move, move, move. I turned toward the exit. The figures outside were closer now. They hadn't moved, hadn't walked. But somehow, in the seconds since I'd last looked, they had halved the distance to the store. They were just standing there, their bodies casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. One of them lifted an arm and pointed at me. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I bolted. I slammed through the exit, my boots scraping against the pavement as I sprinted toward my truck. My rig was still idling, the low rumble of the engine the only real sound in the night. My key was still in the ignition. If I could just get inside, if I could just get moving. A figure was in front of me. Not walking. Not running. Just there. I had a fraction of a second to react before it moved, fast, an unnatural blur of motion. I veered hard to the side, nearly tripping over myself as I dove toward the truck door. I wrenched it open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut just as something hit the side of the cab. The whole truck shook. I jammed the gear into drive, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I gunned it out of the lot. My chest was heaving, my body trembling as the rest stop lights faded in the mirror. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at the passenger seat. Because I knew, in that deep, gut-wrenching part of me that understood something had followed me, that if I looked, I wouldn't be alone. The highway stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cab was too quiet, the air too thick, like the truck itself was holding its breath, waiting. My hands were locked onto the wheel, my knuckles white from the pressure. I knew I couldn't look. Not at the mirrors, not at the passenger seat, not at the sleeper cab behind me. If I acknowledged it, whatever it was, I knew it would make itself known. I kept my foot on the gas, forcing the truck past 80, the tires humming against the asphalt. I just needed to put distance between me and that rest stop. Between me and those things. I flicked my eyes to the clock on the dash, 3:09 a.m. Just past the dead hour. I told myself if I could make it to sunrise, I'd be fine. Then the radio crackled. At first, it was just static. A low hum, popping and hissing like someone was trying to tune in from far away. My breath caught in my throat as the sound shifted, warping into something deeper, wet, like someone breathing against a microphone. Daniel. The whisper curled through the speakers, low and stretched out, as if the voice was testing the shape of my name. My entire body went rigid, my fingers gripping the wheel so hard I thought they might break. You left me behind. The temperature inside the cab plummeted, the windows fogging up at the edges. I could see my breath in the dim glow of the dashboard. I reached for the CB, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the frequencies, desperate to hear anything human. A trucker's voice, some late-night chatter, anything. The static shifted again. I'm still here. A cold, electric thrill shot down my spine. The voice, it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was inside the cab. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stare at the road ahead, refusing to check the seat beside me. But in my peripheral vision, I could see it. A shape. Not moving. Not breathing. Just sitting there. I forced my foot down on the pedal, pushing the truck to 90. My vision blurred at the edges, my mind scrambling for some kind of plan, some kind of escape. And then, the handprint. It started to appear again, forming on the windshield right in front of me. The same long fingers, the same narrow palm. But this time, as I watched, the fingers moved. A slow, dragging motion, as if something was crawling its way forward. I couldn't stop myself. I looked. And for the first time, I saw it. The thing sitting beside me wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. Its skin was pale, stretched too tight over sharp, unnatural bones. Its lips were thin, curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. But its eyes were just empty sockets. Dark holes in its skull, wide and gaping, like it had never needed them. But it was still looking at me. I slammed the brakes. The tires screamed against the pavement, the truck fishtailing as the weight of the trailer lurched forward. I barely managed to keep control, the rig skidding sideways across the empty road before finally jerking to a stop. My breath was ragged, my pulse slamming against my ribs, but the moment the truck went still, I felt it move. Slow. Deliberate. It leaned in. We're not done yet, Daniel. A sharp, cold pain shot through my skull, like something had reached inside and was pulling. My vision blurred, my mind screaming as the edges of reality rippled, distorting like heat waves off asphalt. And then, nothing. The cab was empty. The air was still. The windshield was clear. The seat beside me was just a seat. But I wasn't alone. I could still feel it. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere, in the static hum of the radio, the whisper came again. Drive, Daniel. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I forced myself to process what had just happened. The truck was still, the highway stretched out in front of me, empty and quiet. But something was wrong. The world felt off, like I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, not on the road, but in reality itself. The air inside the cab was thick, heavy, like I was breathing through wet cotton. My hands were shaking, the echo of that voice still rattling around inside my skull. Drive, Daniel. I knew better than to listen. Knew that whatever had been in this truck, whatever had been sitting right beside me, wasn't gone. It was just waiting. I reached for the ignition, my fingers trembling as I twisted the key. The engine coughed once, then twice, before rumbling back to life. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, revealing nothing but the long stretch of desert highway. I pressed down on the gas, easing the rig forward, my entire body wired tight as a tripwire, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I kept my eyes locked on the road, refusing to look at the mirrors, refusing to check the sleeper cab. The temperature inside the truck hadn't warmed back up, the cold still clinging to my skin, sinking into my bones like something alive. I gritted my teeth, forcing my breathing to slow, trying to keep my focus. But then I saw them. Figures. Standing in the distance. At first, they were just shadows, barely visible against the empty stretch of desert. But as I got closer, my headlights caught them, tall, thin people, standing on the side of the highway. They weren't moving, weren't waving for help. Just watching. A shiver crawled up my spine as I tightened my grip on the wheel, forcing myself to stay steady. There were 6 of them. No, 7. Lined up along the shoulder, their heads turning in unison as I passed. My stomach twisted, my instinct screaming at me to floor it, but I kept my speed steady. Then one of them stepped onto the road. I barely had time to react. I slammed the brakes, tires shrieking as the truck lurched forward, my body jerking against the seatbelt. The figure stood directly in my path, illuminated by the harsh glow of my high beams. It was close enough now that I could see its face. Or rather, the lack of one. The skin was stretched tight, smooth and featureless, no eyes, no mouth, just blank flesh where a face should have been. But despite that, I felt it staring at me. My chest clenched, nausea twisting deep in my gut as the thing tilted its head, like it was studying me. Then it moved. Not walked. Not ran. Shifted. One moment, it was in front of me. The next, it was at my driver's side window. I didn't think. I just hit the gas. The truck roared forward, the tires fighting for traction as I tore down the highway, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't look back. Didn't check the mirrors. I just drove, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The figures on the side of the road were gone. The highway stretched out ahead, endless and empty. I should have felt safe. But I didn't. Because the CB radio crackled to life. Static, shifting and warping, the sound twisting into something that wasn't quite human. Then, through the hissing, through the broken distortion, I heard it again. We're not done yet, Daniel. And from the corner of my eye, in the passenger seat, something was sitting beside me again. I didn't turn my head. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the weight of something beside me, pressing into the seat, shifting ever so slightly. The air in the cab had gone ice cold again, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, that makes your breath come out in shaky, fogged-up wisps. My grip on the wheel was so tight my fingers ached, but I refused to move, refused to acknowledge what I already knew was sitting there. The radio hissed again, warping in and out like something was trying to force itself through the signal. The voice came through, not from the CB, but from inside the cab, too close to my ear. You're almost there, Daniel. The words slithered into my head like an infection, curling into the spaces between my thoughts, and I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stay locked on the road. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark, the painted lines rushing beneath my wheels in a blur of white and yellow. My brain screamed at me to pull over, to jump out, to put as much distance between me and whatever had joined me inside the truck. But I knew, the moment I stopped, the moment I acknowledged it, there'd be no getting away. I kept driving, but time felt stretched and wrong, like I had been stuck in this moment forever, trapped in a loop of blacktop and silence. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the world outside had changed. The desert no longer looked like desert. The shadows along the road were too tall, stretching unnaturally, and the stars overhead seemed farther away, dim and blurred, like I was moving deeper into somewhere else. The realization settled in my gut like a sickness. I wasn't on the same highway anymore. I was going somewhere I wasn't meant to be. Then, without warning, the road ended. The breath hitched in my throat as the pavement simply stopped, swallowed by an expanse of absolute black. It wasn't a dead end. It wasn't dirt or gravel. It was nothing. A void. Like the world itself had unraveled beyond this point. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding as the truck lurched violently, the trailer groaning in protest. The whole rig trembled as I fought to keep control, finally coming to a stop inches from the edge of whatever was waiting in the endless darkness. My hands were shaking, my pulse slamming against my ribs as I stared ahead, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then came the whisper, soft and deliberate, sliding into the cab like an unwanted guest. "Time to get out, Daniel." My breath came shallow and sharp, my body coiled so tight it felt like I might snap. The weight in the passenger seat shifted, and the air grew heavier, denser, pressing down on my chest. I knew what was coming, knew what I had been trying to avoid, but it didn't matter. The thing in the seat beside me was turning its head toward me. I didn't think. Didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and jumped. The cold air hit me like a slap as I tumbled onto the asphalt, my knees scraping against the rough pavement. I barely registered the pain, scrambling to my feet, stumbling back as my breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. My eyes flicked to the cab, and that's when I saw it, the thing in my passenger seat. It was looking at me now. And it had my face. Not just similar, exact. Every detail, every crease, every scar, down to the tired, hollow eyes staring back at me with something hungry behind them. It smiled, slow and unnatural, its lips stretching in a way that wasn't meant for human expressions. One long, bony hand reached for the door handle, fingers curling around the metal with an eerie kind of patience. It was getting out. I stumbled back further, my body screaming at me to run, but I felt frozen, locked in place as I watched myself pull free from the truck. It stood, too tall, too thin, its limbs loose, its posture too relaxed, like it was more comfortable in my skin than I had ever been. "We've been driving a long time, Daniel," it said, in my own voice, but there was something else beneath it, a layer of something ancient curling around the edges of the words. It took a step forward, its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the world around me shift. The stars overhead flickered. The darkness beyond the highway breathed. The space I had been standing in a moment ago was no longer safe. "Now it's time for you to rest." It took another step. And smiled. I took another step back, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps, my boots scraping against the asphalt. The thing that wore my face stood just feet away, its body still and loose, like a marionette with its strings cut. It watched me with those hollow, empty sockets where eyes should have been, its lips curled in a slow, creeping smile that didn't belong on my face. The world around us seemed to shift, the road beneath me unsteady, like the highway itself was pulling away, separating me from anything familiar, anything real. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, to think through the panic clawing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I was just exhausted, my mind playing tricks on me, stretching the limits of what the human brain could handle before it cracked. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a bad dream I could wake up from. Something had followed me. Something had been waiting. And now, it was here. It took a step forward, moving with a slow, deliberate ease, its head tilting just slightly, studying me like I was the thing that didn't belong. My pulse pounded against my ribs, my fingers twitching at my sides, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I didn't know where to go. The road was gone. The horizon had melted into nothing, the sky above stretching too far, too deep, a black void where stars flickered in and out, as if struggling to exist. I turned my head, scanning the space around me, searching for anything, a way out, a break in whatever this was, but there was only that thing, standing there in the weak glow of my truck's headlights. "I've been waiting for this," it said in my voice, but the cadence was wrong, the edges of the words curling in ways that weren't human. "You brought me here, Daniel. You let me in." I clenched my jaw, forcing my feet to stay planted, refusing to let it see the fear burning through every nerve in my body. "I don't know what the hell you are," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, "but you sure as hell aren't me." The thing smiled wider, teeth too white, too straight, too perfect, like a mask trying to mimic something human. "Aren't I?" it asked, and in the blink of an eye, it moved. 1 second, it was standing near my truck. The next, it was right in front of me. I barely had time to react before it reached out, its fingers brushing my arm, and the moment it made contact, my mind fractured. The world around me snapped apart, and suddenly, I wasn't standing on the road anymore. I was somewhere else. A dim, flickering light overhead. The hum of an engine. The distant sound of tires on pavement. I was back in the truck. Driving. My fingers were locked around the wheel, my foot pressing steady on the pedal, the road stretching out in front of me. The CB crackled softly in the background, a static hum filling the cab, and for a brief, blissful second, I thought maybe it was a dream. Maybe I had dozed off for a second too long. Maybe the long-haul exhaustion had finally caught up with me. But then I looked in the mirror. The wrong face looked back. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The reflection wasn't mine. It was his. The same hollow, black sockets where eyes should have been. The same stretched, too wide smile curling at the edges. It sat in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the wheel, its body mimicking mine exactly, down to the shallow rise and fall of my chest. I tried to scream, but my throat wouldn't work. My limbs wouldn't respond. I was trapped, watching myself drive, a passenger in my own body, feeling the weight of something else inside me. "It's easy, isn't it?" the voice whispered, but it wasn't coming from the reflection. It was inside my head. "You've been doing this so long, Daniel. The road never ends. You just keep driving." I fought against it, forcing my fingers to move, to twitch, to do anything to break free from whatever had taken hold of me. My body felt distant, sluggish, like I was drowning in something thick and unseen. The headlights ahead illuminated nothing, only endless, winding roads stretching into eternity, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize where I was. "You should rest," the voice cooed, curling around my thoughts like smoke. "Let me drive for a while." I clenched my teeth, forcing my fingers to tighten around the wheel, pushing against the overwhelming exhaustion dragging me down. I could feel it, the thing inside me, trying to take hold, trying to settle in, like it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the right crack in my defenses to slip through. I had to break free. Had to wake up. I did the only thing I could think of. I jerked the wheel hard to the right. The world snapped back in an explosion of motion. I hit the pavement hard, the breath slamming from my lungs as I rolled across the road, the weight of reality crashing back into me all at once. I coughed, gasping for air, my arms shaking as I pushed myself up, my whole body aching from the impact. The truck was still there, idling on the highway, its headlights cutting through the dark. But the thing that had been inside, the thing that had been wearing my face, wasn't in the cab anymore. It was standing in the road, watching me. The expression it wore had changed. The smile was gone. The hunger was still there, but now it looked frustrated. As if I had messed something up. As if I had ruined something important. I forced myself to my feet, my vision still swimming, my breath coming fast and uneven. The ground beneath me felt solid again, the world slowly clicking back into place. I didn't know how, didn't know what had happened or how I had broken free, but I knew one thing. I had to end this. I couldn't just keep running. Because this thing, this version of me, wasn't going to stop. It wanted something, and if I didn't stop it here, on this road, in this moment, I wasn't going to leave this highway alive. I took a slow step forward, squaring my shoulders, my body still trembling but my voice steady. "You want me?" I said, my throat raw, my breath heavy. "Then come get me." The thing didn't move, didn't react. Then, finally, it smiled again. And it took a step forward. I squared my stance, forcing my breath to slow even as the adrenaline tore through me. The thing that wore my face stepped forward, deliberate and slow, its two long fingers curling and uncurling at its sides. The smile was back, stretching across its face with something almost amused, like it was enjoying this, like it had already won. The night around us was unnatural, too dark, too deep, the horizon lost in an ocean of shifting shadows that seemed to breathe in and out, expanding and contracting with every beat of my heart. The truck's headlights cast long, jagged streaks across the pavement, illuminating that thing in front of me. The features were mine, but they were too smooth, too precise, like a photograph with just a few details blurred, enough to make your brain scream that something wasn't right. "You've been fighting so hard, Daniel," it said in my voice, but it wasn't my voice. It had the sound of it, the weight of it, but there was something underneath, something ancient, something hungry. "You don't have to fight anymore. Just let go." My fingers twitched at my sides, my fists clenching and unclenching. I wasn't a man who scared easy. I had faced down blizzards in Montana, tornadoes in Oklahoma, jackknifed rigs on icy highways in the dead of night. I had nearly bled out once after a bad wreck outside of Kansas City, stuck in my cab, my own leg pinned under the dashboard until emergency crews arrived. I had been through hell, but this wasn't something I could punch, or outrun, or outdrive. This thing wasn't just trying to kill me. It was trying to replace me. I took a slow step back, careful, measured, my boots scraping against the asphalt. The thing matched me, stepping forward at the exact same speed, our movements mirroring each other like a grotesque dance. My heart slammed against my ribs, my mind racing, trying to piece together a plan. Running wouldn't work. I had already learned that. And if I let it touch me again, if I let it pull me back into that place, into that broken loop of road that stretched forever, I wasn't coming back. "This is what you've always wanted, isn't it?" it continued, tilting its head like it was studying me. "A break. Rest. A way out of the cycle. You don't even like the road anymore, Daniel. You don't even remember why you started driving in the first place. Let me take over. You can sleep." I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. It wasn't lying. Not entirely. I had been running for so long, hauling freight across this country for over 20 years, watching the same highways blur together, the same sunrises bleeding into the same sunsets. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the hollowing out of a man who spent more time in his cab than he did in a home. I had thought about quitting more times than I could count, and even convinced myself I would someday. But I had never actually done it. Because this road was all I had left. And that's why this thing had come for me. It knew. It knew. That's why it was still smiling, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to take one more step back, waiting for that moment when I hesitated, when I let the exhaustion win. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't going to let it take me. I exhaled sharply, shifting my weight forward instead of back, my muscles tensing as I lunged. It must not have expected that, because for the first time, that twisted smile faltered. My fist connected with its jaw, but it wasn't like hitting flesh, it was like punching wet concrete, solid but wrong, and an awful cracking sound echoed through the night. The thing staggered back, but it didn't fall. Its head twisted at an unnatural angle, a gaping split forming across its cheek, but there was no blood, just something dark and thick, like oil, like tar, bubbling at the edges of the wound. It turned its head back toward me, the cracked ceiling, the flesh knitting itself back together. "Fighting only makes it worse," it whispered, its voice stretching, distorting, shifting into something deeper, something older. And then it lunged at me. I barely had time to move before it collided with me, its weight impossible, crushing, sending us both tumbling onto the pavement. My skull cracked against the road, stars exploding behind my eyes, and then its hands, my hands, were on my throat. I gasped, struggling, the world tilting sideways, my vision going dark at the edges. Its grip was cold, seeping into my skin like frostbite, like death itself, and my body screamed in panic, my lungs burning as it whispered one last time. "Shoo. It's over now." No. I wasn't going to let it win. With the last of my strength, I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around something cold and metallic, my lighter. My trusty old Zippo, the one I had carried for over 15 years, even long after I had quit smoking. I flicked it open, my thumb snapping the flint. The flame roared to life, bright and hot, and in one desperate motion, I jammed it into the thing's chest. The reaction was immediate. The thing screamed. Not in pain. Not in anger. But in rage. Its entire body convulsed, the flesh twisting, warping, as the flame spread like wildfire across its skin. The tar-like substance beneath it boiled, hissing and popping, and suddenly it wasn't me anymore. It was something else, something raw and shapeless, something that had never been human. Its hollow sockets widened in fury as it reeled back, its grip on me breaking, and I took my chance. I shoved it off with everything I had left, crawling backward on my hands and knees, gasping for air as I watched the thing burn. The flames weren't normal. They weren't orange. They were white-hot, almost blue, like pure heat, like something cleansing away the unnatural. It writhed, screeching, the sound piercing through the night, making the world tremble around us. The pavement beneath it cracked, split, and for a single moment, I saw what was beneath, not earth, not asphalt, but something else entirely, something endless, something hollow, something waiting. And then, it was gone. The flames snapped out, the road sealing itself like it had never been broken. The air was still, the night normal again, the distant hum of an approaching highway patrol car breaking through the silence. I lay there, staring up at the sky, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gulps. I was alive. And I was alone. For the first time all night, I felt like I was really back. I didn't know how long I lay there before I finally forced myself to move. My truck was still idling, waiting for me, like nothing had happened. I climbed back in, wincing at the pain in my ribs, my throat still raw from the thing's grip. The dashboard clock read 4:42 a.m. The night was almost over. I put the truck in gear and started driving. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't look in the mirrors. I just kept my eyes on the road. Because I knew, whatever that thing had been, whatever it had wanted, it had failed. But I also knew this road had never really been empty. And it never would be.